Welcome into this edition of the Blue White Breakdown, presented once again by Penn State Health. Dustin Hockensmith here, Daniel Gallen with us as well. We've got a couple interesting recruiting topics, which we will continue to cover in this space each and every Friday on the Blue White Breakdown. And this time around, we looked at quarterbacks last week. We'll look at running backs here coming up, and also just at Penn State's athleticism and speed. It was a factor last week at Wisconsin. We expect it will be a factor again this week against Ball State. Two really solid opponents, fundamentally sound, have an identity. But Penn State was able to win that game at Wisconsin with better athleticism. And I think it'll be the difference here coming up against Ball State. We'll look at how Penn State went about getting that advantage, the years of recruiting that went into it. Daniel, you ready to get into some of the news and notes from the week for starters? We'll talk about the Ball State matchup, then we'll get into some recruiting.
Yeah, let's do it. It should be, coming off last week. It'll be interesting to see what happens in week two. The old cliche, biggest improvement happens week 1 to week 2. So we'll see what we're in for this weekend.
And they're coming home for the first time in front of fans. I think they said about 650 days since they last played in front of a real home crowd. I think there's going to be some juice flowing at Beaver Stadium. Couple of things from the week I wanted to catch up on. I'm sure Bob and Dave tackled this, but James Franklin addressed the place kicking situation and mentioned that it's still Jordan Stout in all of those phases, but that he expects Jake Pinniger at some point to help this team out.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were surprised when they saw Jordan Stout go out there for the extra point and the short field goals. And then the fact that, he hadn't kicked an extra point since 2018 when he was at Virginia Tech. He hadn't taken a field goal attempt less than 40 yards in his entire college career. He had that reputation as the big leg guy. I think I believe what James Franklin says when, he talked about all August, where he said, we're tracking everything. We're looking at the numbers. We're trying to see, where the differences are in guys, and whoever does better in practice will win the job. And I think that is what happened. Stout, I guess, who knows what the number actually was, but Stout was better enough, and there was enough of an edge that they went with him over Pinniger. Obviously, Franklin pointed it out, having someone handling kickoffs, punting, which Stout was very good at, extra points, and all field goals. That's a lot for one guy. It's the type of thing where when you think about NFL rosters, everyone's like, oh, like, why can't you just get one guy to do everything? But the reality is that these jobs are very different. They're very hard. So it'll be interesting to see how that, goes on. Maybe there will be a couple games this year where Pinniger gets some time, either, so that the coaches can see what they have in him, or just to give Stout a break. So, I think it was a surprise to see Stout out there. I'm not surprised that they're going to stick with him. James Franklin likes his numbers. Penn State likes their numbers, and I think that they want to stick with what the numbers say.
And I have no doubt when it comes to being thorough and tracking everything, James Franklin will be honest about that. He will be tracking everything about everything. Also, going from 1 week to the next, making a change like this early doesn't make much sense. But it could get to a point if there's another game or two like Wisconsin, where you're talking about the real world application of those numbers and what they were tracking in training camp, and how this setting differs from what they were going through in training camp. They're lucky, I guess, in some respects, to have Jake Pinniger as a nice fallback option there. KeAndre Lambert-Smith, another name, I think you've been tracking him personally for several weeks now, watching what he can do, and an instrumental figure, I think, in this Penn State offense, which needs a third receiving threat. Certainly last week, 4 catches for 71 yards. He had that drop where he got a little ahead of himself, but clearly he was a factor then. And I think what they've been saying this week kind of backs up that, I think there is an expectation in this program that he will continue to be a factor, and maybe a bigger factor as the year goes on.
Yeah, KeAndre Lambert-Smith was definitely one of the more intriguing guys entering the season. Obviously, Jahan Dotson, number 1. Parker Washington established himself as number 2 last year. And then there's kind of that mess of Daniel George, Cam Sullivan-Brown, KeAndre Lambert-Smith, some other guys. And, Lambert-Smith probably saw the most time out of all those guys last year, 15 catches, 138 yards as a true freshman. But he was the first guy out there as the third wide receiver on Saturday. He stayed out there and he delivered. That 52-yard catch down the seam was a really nice play where Sean Clifford hung in there. Lambert-Smith, was there to make the catch. And the big conversation about Lambert-Smith entering the season, whether it was Taylor Stubblefield or Jahan Dotson talking about him, was the mental side of the game. Basically, Lambert-Smith was the type of guy that if he made a mistake, he couldn't just flush it. It would stay with him for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 plays. And when that happens, things start to snowball. So, he talked about how Taylor Stubblefield tells him to close the door, kind of move on from that stuff. And then last night, James Franklin was kind of talking about how there's less peaks and valleys now in Lambert-Smith's play, that he's more consistent, and that when he came in as a freshman, Franklin highlighted 3 things about freshmen that he usually sees is that they're competitive, they're emotional, and they talk a lot. And Lambert-Smith was all of those things. And now he's taken all of that and kind of put it together into a package where he can deliver on the field and he can make plays, and that if there is that drop, that doesn't stick with him, for the next half a quarter, half, whatever.
I think there were 2 guys last year, maybe more, but KeAndre Lambert-Smith was one and Jair Brown was one, where the Penn State coaching staff invested and they showed their hand in terms of how they felt about both of these players by giving them playing time in certain situations where just knowing that experience was going to benefit them this year as much as anything. And both of those guys are now, what I would say are starters on this team, and key guys. Jair Brown with a key pick last week, KeAndre Lambert-Smith with a nice game, and I expect more of that from him. Another theme for this week was Mike Yurcich, and I think Sean Clifford answered this question after the Wisconsin game, just talking about having Mike Yurcich, his presence on the sideline and his demeanor. It sounded like projected some confidence, and he wasn't freaking out, he wasn't emotional and raising his voice, and it sounded like the decision to be there on the sideline is paying some early dividends for this team.
Yeah, yesterday center Mike Miranda said that Yurcich is a great leader, that he's putting them in the right spot, where they need to be. And then Lambert-Smith expanded on it a little bit. Someone asked him, at halftime, if you guys go in, the offense is not playing well at all, who's the one that kind of steps up? Who's the voice that you hear to kind of rally the team? And he said it was Yurcich, that Yurcich told them it was 0-0, that things are going to happen, that they're still in the game, that they still have the chance to kind of kick things into gear. And it's very clear that the offense responded to that. You come out, you have the long pass to Jahan Dotson, you have a couple other big plays by Dotson, Lambert-Smith, Noah Kane. Things kind of really started to kick into gear. And I think that Yurcich, the play caller, and Yurcich, the strategist, deserves a lot of credit for that. But from what the players were saying, Yurcich, the coach, I think, and the leader, really played a role in kind of keeping that steady, because that's how players are. They take their cues from what the guys above them are doing, where if Yurcich is freaking out, then maybe Sean Clifford freaks out, which kind of it goes down the line. So Yurcich, fiery guy, but if he can project that calm and kind of that confidence, I think that goes a long way.
Always an interesting decision, whether you as a coordinator up top, where you benefit from being able to get that sky view and see a little bit better what's going on defensively, and being down on the field to be hands-on. And I really feel like the further we go, the more it looks like this is the best decision, because I think, I am guilty of this sometimes too, just viewing the offensive coordinator as the guy who calls plays. And sometimes you forget about this guy being an actual coach and being on the sideline there with this quarterback, with this offense, especially this early in the year. Being able to coach these guys and set that tone has been huge. And I think it was big last week. As we move from road to home here to Beaver Stadium, Penn State put out just a few changes in the game day experience. Anything that you want to share from that would be particularly helpful if you're going to a game for the first time in 2 years?
Yeah, the big thing that Penn State emphasized on Tuesday is the mobile ticketing. They want fans to have all of their tickets downloaded, on the phone, in, Apple Wallet, Google Pay, whatever, ready to go when you get there, so that there's not people, waiting at the gate, trying to get things to load in a big crowd of people. I think the big thing that Penn State is kind of emphasizing is, being prepared so that there's an expedient entry, so that there's not, a lot of big crowds waiting, which obviously with COVID, that's a concern, having a bunch of people in a small space. But I think just in general, like the overall experience is that they want people to be in the seats when, it's time for kickoff. Um, they're opening gates 2.5 hours early, and the first 45 of those minutes, there's a concessions deal. It's like $1 off for every $5 you spend. But I think that the big thing that the deputy director of athletics, Scott Sidwell, really emphasized is just know before you go. That's the phrase they're using, and just kind of being prepared, knowing where you need to be, having your parking ready, and having your tickets ready. I think that was kind of the big emphasis from Penn State going into Saturday.
It's good advice no matter what, especially as they're making these sweeping changes that some might say are a little overdue, but they're here now, and I think they're going to be good ultimately. But everybody has a role in that Beaver Stadium situation. As we're coming back home now for Penn State's home opener, Ball State. I just want to get your early perspective on them. And I noticed we put our PennLive picks up on Thursday, and I was the only one, I believe, who had Penn State covering this 22-point spread. I actually like that quite a bit, and I'm happy to explain why. But why don't you kind of break down what you see in this matchup?
Yeah, I mean, we can go with my pick first. I have Penn State 35, Ball State 14, 22-point spread. I'm just kind of sneaking it in there. I think that that's kind of a little bit of the NFL reporter left in me, where when you see such a big number, all those games are close, that you're kind of like, I don't know if I can pull the trigger on that. But yesterday morning I saw Bill Connolly's SP Plus picks that has Penn State winning big. And the more that I kind of thought about it, I was kind of like, probably should have picked. I think I could have picked Penn State to cover, but it's the type of thing where how much of last week, that first half, was an anomaly. How much, are they the first half or are they the second half? That's a big question that they have to answer. And until they answer that, I'm not necessarily comfortable going with that. And then with Ball State, I mean, they're a veteran team. They're going to be ready. They have some playmakers in the passing game. And Penn State's strength is the secondary. But, it's early. Still don't quite know what this team is. Ball State isn't kind of the usual early season slappy. So I'm just kind of not, I don't know. I just couldn't go 23 points.
I get that completely. I get all that completely. For me, Wisconsin could not have been a better dress rehearsal, so to speak, for this home opener, because what Ball State is going to want to try to do to establish that run game, be patient, move the chains, rely on your ability to create favorable third down situations, all that stuff that Wisconsin was trying to do. Ball State won't be trying to do. And Penn State survived that Wisconsin team, which would arguably, better up front, better talent across the board. Then the one thing that really stood out, for Penn State side, the speed and athleticism that you can talk about fundamentals all day long, but Wisconsin was having to overcommit to things because they knew that Penn State was faster in so many positions across the board on both sides of the ball. So when they're getting some of that horizontal action on offense, that some of that motion, some of that getting the ball out quick to the sidelines, these safeties and linebackers are having to take steps in anticipation of that. And when you're creating that situation, you're just creating possibilities down the field, which they were able to get going against Wisconsin, not as much as maybe they could have. I expect the same dynamic to be in play against Ball State, where that athleticism and speed will catch them at some point in time. If the Penn State offense doesn't beat itself, I picked 45-17. I respect this Ball State team, what they did last year. I also saw them give up 237 yards to the top wide receiver from Western Illinois. So one or both of Jahan Dotson and Parker Washington are gonna go nuts, I think, on Saturday. And I think maybe KeAndre Lambert-Smith and maybe these tight ends who did not have a catch last week, maybe they get involved. I mean, I just think there's too much athleticism and speed, and if they can lean on this defense to be elite, then they're going to cover this spread. That's how and the longer this week went, kind of like you, the more I subscribe to that theory. So that's where I was coming from.
Yeah, definitely. The more I thought about what we saw against Wisconsin, and when you think about players like Joey Porter Jr. in the secondary, like Tariq Castro Fields, like Jair Brown, Jaquan Brisker, think about the types of athletes those guys are on the back end. The Ball State's wide receivers, Justin Hall could get his yards, but it's really hard to kind of see, lapses. Danny Davis from Wisconsin had a great game, but he was making circus catches. He was, barely open against Three Castro Fields. And, I think that there is the difference between a Big Ten team and a MAC team. Even the best MAC team should probably still be, around 30 points. So, Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening, when I look back at my pick, I might, or once Penn State, hits a couple deep balls to Jahan Dotson, I might be second guessing myself a little bit more, but I think I'm more subscribing to kind of your breakdown of things at this point in the week.
Well, it's a nice segue, I think, just talking about that advantage we expect to unfold, because that was one of the things that I think a lot of people were talking about with Wisconsin. We know what they're doing from a recruiting standpoint. We know they're getting guys, and they, more than most teams in the nation, know what they're looking for in a prospect, how they fit what they do, what the right temperament, mentality, size, frame, how to develop them when they get into the weight room. They know exactly what their system is, and they get guys who fit their system very, very well, and they do it year in and year out. One of the most consistent forces you'll find in college football is Wisconsin. But this is a Penn State team then that has now beaten that Wisconsin team 5 times in a row with a little different formula. And, I think just the idea of building a roster with speed, and from I know it's 1 week and it's a small sample, but to me, this looks like the Penn State roster under James Franklin that has the most NFL tools on it. He needed a couple years to really get his recruits stocked into his system. Had obviously some good players early, Gesicki, Godwin, those guys. But now I think you're seeing talent, speed, NFL tools up and down. And sometimes, Curtis Jacobs, a lot of the running backs were highly regarded. Jahan Dotson was highly regarded coming out, not a perfect prospect by any means. So sometimes all that physical ability comes from recruiting, and oftentimes it comes from development. I think Jahan Dotson has come a long way with his speed and quickness. Jaquan Brisker has developed in a big way. Ellis Brooks and Brenton Strange are good examples of guys who were really good prospects who have become better players through development. And then, we mentioned, I think you and I talked about this briefly this week. Arnold Ebiketie is a really good example of both evaluating him coming from Temple and now helping him take that next step and develop where he is. And the example is he is just as fast as the moment he walked through Penn State's doors in January, but he's now 20 pounds heavier, which you saw all that, the size, power, and speed last week. And it's just, from recruiting to development, they are getting guys with big time tools, and they continue to do a great job of putting them in position to succeed with those tools.
Yeah, I mean, Dwight Galt's strength staff just does, year in and year out, just does a ridiculous job with getting these guys ready. Jahan Dotson ran the 4.3340, which I think would have been the third or fourth fastest time at the combine in 2020. And when he came in, he was on the smaller side, I think 5'11", 165 as a senior, but he wasn't a burner. He was just kind of a good, solid wide receiver. And even now, when you watch him play, you don't necessarily think he's a burner. He's just very solid. Last night he was asked, how do you get open? What do you do to get open? And he just said, I use my God-given ability to do it. So he's not lacking in the confidence department either. But yeah, I mean, I think you just kind of look at, how these guys have developed, especially a guy like Arnold Ebiketie, where, he was at Temple, which is a D1 FBS program and, a solid one. But at the same time, it's not Penn State. There's not the same amount of resources. So, I think once he got into the strength program that, he's kind of another one of those guys who's a walking advertisement for what Dwight Galt and company can do. And you kind of look at so many of the other guys who fit into that category before. So I think that, that's always the thing where, whenever you talk to these guys, especially on the lines, where, all right, you're coming in, you have to put on this weight. How do you know it's the right amount of weight? How do you make sure that you're not sacrificing any other tools while bulking up? Well, Penn State knows exactly how to do that.
And every player is different. Every objective versus what they do well versus what you want to keep versus what you want to improve. There's always a push and a pull, and they do an exceptional job. That's nothing new. One thing, usually we do a little bit of planning during the week. I'm going to do some planning as we record now, looking at the 2018 recruiting class again will be a fascinating thing, because that's where Jahan Dotson was coming from. So
Mhm.
many, they had 3 5-stars in that class, including Micah Parsons. They had another one in Justin Fields who was committed and decommitted. But you
Mhm.
look a little bit further down, like the layer with Jahan Dotson in it, and that was a really interesting and a very, very good class in a different way than I expected it to be when they signed. So maybe next week or the week after we can look at something like that on this podcast.
Yeah, no, while you were talking, I pulled it up because I wanted to see what Dotson was listed at coming out. And Justin Shorter is there. He was supposed to be the wide receiver that's doing what Jahan Dotson is doing now. And it's really, I don't know, we talk about it all the time in the recruiting where the stars do matter, that most of the time those 5-star guys are the best guys in the country. They're the ones who go to the NFL. But Penn State, is kind of through their strength program has really kind of been able to twist things a little bit where they're getting that elite high 4-star, 5-star talent, but at the same time that they have the consistent ability to really lift those, maybe mid-level, lower level 4-stars, high 3-stars into real contributors. So that's something that I think would be definitely be a lot of fun to look at.
And we'll touch on running back recruiting as promised earlier, but just one final note there. The Justin Shorter versus Jahan Dotson thing is really interesting because we're only 3 or 4 years removed from that recruiting class. And I feel like the prototype of what a good wide receiver is at both college and the pros has changed quite a bit, where a Jahan Dotson is getting closer to being the prototype. The idea of being undersized or too thin or all that stuff. Devontae Smith, who's in Philadelphia, unbelievable season last year at Alabama, won the Heisman Trophy, incredible year. He's a first round pick. And Jahan Dotson is going now into into the NFL draft. If he has a monster year, as it looks like he's going to, I don't think NFL teams are going to care that much about how big or how strong he is, because the rules with no contact down the field and no contact close to the line of scrimmage anymore, it kind of benefits you if you're not 6'3", 220 now. And that has changed quite a bit. And it speaks to, James Franklin talked this week about college football setting the trends that now the pros are following. And I feel like this is kind of another little facet of that. So just an interesting situation from that 18 class in particular.
Mhm. Yeah, I think when you talk about Dotson and looking at his potential in the pros, and when you talk about what Franklin was kind of talking about in terms of how the ideas change and what the NFL guys are running, what the college guys are running, and how there's a lot more trickle up. I think that it's just kind of the name of the game now is just getting your athletes the ball in space and letting them make plays. And Dotson, given his frame and his athletic ability, that's something he can do on a really consistent basis. They can give him the ball in the flat. He can take it 80 yards. He can go over the top. You just kind of have to get him open, get him the ball, and something will happen. Whereas I'm a sucker for 6'4", 6'5", 220. When you see that listed, when you watch those guys play, they play above the rim. It's a lot of fun. And I really like those wide receivers. But, it's kind of there's the way that the offenses are going, there's still a place for them, but it's not really it doesn't feel like they're the primary guys as much anymore.
Stephon Diggs, you're a Maryland guy just like you, is another good example of that. If you want that guy to go up and play above the rim, you want that guy in the red zone, you want that fade route, you want all that stuff. But at the same time, if Stephon Diggs can get open at will, which he can, I mean,
Mhm.
how valuable is that tool? All right, let's shift gears to running backs here as our last kind of talking point. Everybody kind of knows the deal where Penn State's coming from with running back recruiting. I just thought week one was another refresher on not just how they're recruiting the position, how they're developing and how they're deploying. And 2021, this season here, reminds me a bit of 2019, where the depth chart started out with 5 guys and you're wondering, oh my gosh, how are they going to use all 5 of these guys? And the answer to that question is almost like week to week. week to week, it could change. The hot hand could change. Just a brief background, then I'll kind of get your take here. Is 2019, that class had Devin Ford and Noah Cain, two really different running backs there. 2020, Kevon Lee and Keziah Holmes, again, two different running backs. No running backs in 21. Now they've got two committed in 22, and Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen. Allen's that more physical runner, just as Kevon Lee was in 2020, just as Noah Cain was in 2019. And you're seeing that they're using these guys and they're mixing and matching. The point being, I think if you can run and you make the most of your opportunities, you're going to get opportunities no matter how many backs they have.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, with all the depth that they have guys that they can use in a bunch of different ways. Maybe we'll see more of that against Ball State. Maybe we'll see more of that against Auburn, Villanova. Just kind of going up against that. It's really hard to have takeaways from going up against that Wisconsin defense. The running game conversation is, that's for another day, but I think it was through 4 drives. My favorite stat from the day was through 4 drives, the Penn State running backs had 4 carries for 4 yards with a long run of 4. So it was that kind of day for them. But, back to kind of the usage deployment, I think that it's really easy to kind of, put these guys in silos where you look at Katron Allen, 5'11", 220. I think there's a quote from his running backs coach to 24/7 Sports that, he's running like a locomotive right now. And I think that is very apt when you watch him play. And then Nick Singleton is kind of regarded as more of the athletic, can make the plays in space, but you watch his highlight tape and he's still running between the tackles. He's lowering his shoulder. He's making things happen and running away from guys. So, I think it'll be interesting. And I think that this is kind of where the development thing comes up again too, where, Noah Cain, obviously his 34-yard run in the fourth quarter was big, but I think that maybe 2 of his bigger plays were when he caught, passes out in the flat, made a guy miss and got a first down. And he's someone where when you think Noah Cain, you don't necessarily think receiving back out on the edge in space. So I think that that's a testament to the development that the staff does and to Noah Cain himself. But when you look at Singleton and Allen, it's just a very fun duo. And I think that they both do things differently, that they both do a lot of things similarly, but I think the common thread with both of them is that they do a lot of things really well.
And I think just looking at it, Singleton looks to me to be the best, maybe most dynamic running back recruit that they've gotten since Saquon Barkley. And nothing against any of these other guys, but Singleton is kind of a different breed. And to bring him and Allen at the same time, as you mentioned, not to say that Allen can't be a force on the edges and you don't want to typecast these guys, but they do get things done in a different way. And it happens to be a complementary way. It's kind of the Penn State approach to recruiting running backs. So there you go. And as you mentioned before, I do think, topically, you'll see this running game a more concerted effort to get these guys going when they presumably have a nice advantage up front. Not much they could do last week against Wisconsin, especially early in that game. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think Noah Cain went more than 2.5 quarters without a carry at one point. And, it was slow going for them. And when you're in a bunch of 3rd and longs, it wasn't a good combination. But, going back to Singleton, for one last note, it's going to be really interesting to see kind of how his physical tools continue to develop through his senior season. Right now, 24/7 Sports has him as the number 1 running back in the country, in their own house rankings. I think he's number 6 in the composite among running backs. But there's a lot of high expectations. And, when you think about best running backs in the country, you think about guys from Florida, guys from Georgia, and kind of, more of when you look at them, the physically intimidating types, like Zamir White a couple years ago was just an enormous guy coming out. And so, I think Singleton is a really interesting case, and it'll be interesting to see kind of where his national profile is, where he falls in the rankings when all is said and done for his senior year at Governor Mifflin.
Penn State in good shape now at the running back spot. Looks to be in better shape when these guys arrive next year. That's Daniel Gallen. I'm Dustin Hockensmith. That's it for this edition of the Friday recruiting episode of the Blue White Breakdown. We'll be here every Friday for as long as we know, certainly through the end of the season. Be sure to check us out each Friday on the Blue White Breakdown. You can check us out on Alexa, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, and on YouTube too, just in case you want to see that Daniel Gallen mustache in real time. We don't have it in 1080p just yet, so all of the follicles, they might blur together at close range, but we're working on that. Between now and then, we'll see you next Friday.